Here we are at the start of the second passage of LSAT PrepTest 157's first section, the reading comprehension section. And as always, before we even engage with question 6 here, we're going to click the passage only view. We're going to select the highlight color, and we're going to engage with the passage up front to determine what the main idea sentence or sentences are for every individual paragraph so that we can understand the main themes before going to individual questions. So, starting from the top of a rather large first paragraph, grammarians of the prescriptive school take it as part of their task to distinguish correct from incorrect usage in language and thereby to encourage the former. They believe that in so doing, they play an essential role in preventing a constantly changing language from falling into disarray. In contrast, descriptive grammarians are so called because they are content to describe the way language is actually used by members of the community. In their eyes, those who seek to preserve some forms of usage while preventing others from gaining a foothold are being unscientific and are, moreover, doomed to almost certain failure. Descriptivists point to numerous examples of usage that were once judged by prescriptivists to be incorrect, but that over time and through continual use have come to be almost universally accepted. One example is the use of data as a singular noun in English. Prescriptivists have typically regarded the phrase "the data is incomplete" as ungrammatical on the grounds that data is the plural of the Latin noun datum and should continue to be treated as a plural in English out of respect for the word's origins. Descriptivists argue that data, in addition to its use as a plural, has acquired a widespread use as a singular mass term like water. It would be pointless, they say, to try to reverse this trend. A lot of information, and I really don't want to get bogged down in the details. But we should be able to determine that we basically have two options that are presented by this author. We have the grammarians who are introduced in the very first sentence, and then we have the contrast of the descriptive grammarians to that prescriptive school from the very first sentence. So we can just summarize these two sentences by highlighting them as opposed to going into all the details. We know that the prescriptive school takes it as part of their task to distinguish correct from incorrect usage in language and thereby to encourage the former, meaning the correct usage. Whereas the descriptive grammarians just describe how language is used in the community without getting into the details of whether it's right or wrong. And then we've got this big discussion of the uh, implications of that, and we've got the example. And the example, we'll get into potentially down the line, but we don't want to highlight anything in that example just yet because we might be overemphasizing one detail over another rather arbitrarily. So we've got these two highlighted sentences at this point, and we're going to go move on to the second paragraph, which begins, this example illustrates the two main objections of descriptivists to prescriptivism. The first is the scientific objection. The transformation of language is governed by laws not unlike the laws of nature, and those trying to hold back linguistic change might as well attempt to defy the law of gravity. The second is the egalitarian objection. The prescriptivists are simply trying to impose their own linguistic practices, which are usually those of an educated and affluent elite, upon other members of society. The suggestion is that the attempted imposition is somehow immoral. Okay, so we know that this paragraph is clearly concerned with the two main objections of the descriptivists to prescriptivism based on the example. And this is where the approach can be a little bit flexible. I don't want to go and highlight everything in this paragraph, meaning the first objection and the second objection. I just know that if I need to know details about those objections, I can get them later. But I am going to need to connect to the example. And again, we generally do want to have just two sentences per paragraph. But every now and again, the LSAT is going to give you a giant paragraph like we had here. And I'm just going to highlight what the example is because now we basically have four sentences stretched out over two paragraphs, and everything's going to pull together and create an overall narrative. Again, we don't need to get the details of what the two main objections are. We just know that the example that we've now highlighted is illustrating those two main objections. And if we need details about those main objections, we'll get them later. But we continue on to the third paragraph, and I'm going to actually just click next page now so that I can frame up everything in that third paragraph. With regard to the scientific objection, it should be noted that while many attempts to regulate language have failed, some have succeeded. Descriptivists may respond that in the latter cases, the usages favored by prescriptivists were in accordance with the laws governing linguistic change and would have prevailed without their assistance. But this is in large measure an article of faith. In the end, it must be acknowledged that the laws governing the transformation of language are not like the laws of physics. Language usage depends on choices made by individuals who are subject to persuasion. In response to the egalitarian objection, prescriptivists point to the importance of standard language usage for the free exchange of ideas. Those to whom preservation of the standard is entrusted inevitably possess some of the attributes of an elite, but their aim is one of inclusion rather than exclusion. Now, this final paragraph is quite interesting because it immediately talks about the two objections. So you can see that the way the passage is structured, you actually benefit from not highlighting everything in this middle second paragraph. But we know that we want to grab the two objections that are presented by the prescriptivists now compared to the descriptivists in the arena of grammar, as it were. So we start by highlighting the response to the scientific objection, so that it should be noted that while many attempts to regulate language have failed, some have succeeded. So you can actually regulate language and enforce the usage if you were a prescriptivist. And then we get the response to the egalitarian objection, which is talking about having a standard so that everything is freely exchanged. So we should be able to pull out these highlights. And again, our job with a denser, more abstract topic is very often just to stay high level in the upfront read. And you then, of course, at the end of selecting your highlighted sentences, will want to read through those highlights to make sure that you've got a coherent overall narrative, which we'll do now. Grammarians of the prescriptive school take it as part of their task to distinguish correct from incorrect usage in language and thereby to encourage the former. In contrast, descriptive grammarians are so called because they are content to describe the way language is actually used by members of a community. One example is the use of data as a singular noun in English. The prescriptivists have typically regarded the phrase the data is incomplete as ungrammatical, on the grounds that data is the plural of the Latin noun datum and should continue to be treated as a plural in English out of respect for the word's origins. This example illustrates the two main objections of descriptivists to prescriptivism. With regard to the scientific objection, it should be noted that while many attempts to regulate language have failed, some have succeeded. In response to the egalitarian objection, prescriptivists point to the importance of standard language usage for the free exchange of ideas. So, this is a rather abstract topic, and we're talking about two different ways of approaching grammar. And we want to note that actually, even though I would argue that most modern readers are probably going to be more pro descriptivists, this author is in favor of the prescriptivism and is basically addressing the objections of the descriptivists to prescriptivism in that final paragraph. So hopefully now we've got our overall main idea understood and we can move on to addressing the questions for this passage next.